Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History Vibe podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Dennis MacDonald. And today we're going to be discussing Luke Acts and its use of Papias and the Homeric epics. With that being said, Dennis, thank you very much for joining me today.
Well, thank you. It's always a pleasure, Jacob.
I want to start us off with the first question, and that is I want to cover first Luke's use of Papias and then work our way up to its use of Homer. So, my first question in two parts is first, who is Papias? And second, how does Luke Acts use Papias?
That's a very important question, and it's one that's highly contested among scholars. I'm in the minority of saying that Luke knows Papias. The first thing to say, Jacob, is that we do know the relative dating of the two works. That is, Papias of Hierapolis finished his exposition of Logia about the Lord around the year 110. He does not know the Gospel of Luke, and he doesn't know the Gospel of John, but he knows three Gospels, two of which are in the New Testament. One is Mark and one is Matthew. The other is a book that looks like Matthew that Papias thought was a translation of Hebrew Matthew, which never existed. And it's likely the Q document. Now, that's not what we want to talk about today, but that's what Papias was concerned about, how to harmonize the sequences of episodes in the three Gospels that he knew. The dating for Luke Acts is most likely between 120 and 130. So if there's a relationship between the two, it has to be in the direction of Luke's use of Papias, not the other way around. Now, Papias is from Hierapolis, Asia Minor, and Luke likely is writing from Ephesus, and they're both in Western Asia Minor. So even though their dating is different, their geographical situation is relatively close. There are only two places where the relationship between Luke and Papias becomes most striking, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But there are some other places that are quite fascinating. In the Acts of the Apostles, we have the selection of Barsabbas Justus, but in Papias, there was a Justus Barsabbas. Those are the only places independently that we have a reference to this character. In the Acts of the Apostles, we have the daughters of Philip, but we also have the daughters of Philip mentioned in the fragments of Papias. By the way, Papias' 5-volume work only appears in about a dozen manuscripts. Testimonia. We don't even have manuscripts of the work itself. We have citations. We also have a reference in the Acts of the Apostles to the deaths of James and John, and we find that also in Papias. So Luke has lots of stuff piled up in the Acts of the Apostles that has affinities almost nowhere else but in Papias. Now, the two places where Luke's use of Papias is most obvious is in their prefaces and in how they treat the death of Judas. And we certainly wish we had more of Papias' exposition, but we just have to do the best we can with what we have. Papias has a long preface in which he is telling an unnamed patron who's addressed in the second person singular, you, about what his project was in creating this 5-volume work. By the way, Luke also is the only author in the New Testament to have a multi-volume work. And by another piece of it is, by the way, that Papias talks about things that happen after the death of Jesus up to his own time, and so does Luke, except it ends with the incarceration of Paul. So Papias is talking about how his sources differ from each other, how he wants to put them together in the correct order. He's following what he's heard from witnesses that are called elders who are stopping by. He favors oral tradition and so on. Luke is doing the same thing. He's talking about why he wants to put these gospels in the correct order. That's involved in both of them. They both are dealing with earlier documents that are about Jesus that differ from each other, and he wants to harmonize them. The vocabulary is really very close. And scholars have not taken seriously that what Luke is doing is imitating the preface of Papias. But where the connection between these documents becomes most fascinating is with the death of Judas. According to Papias, there are people who were upset with Matthew's understanding of the death of Judas as martyrdom. He didn't, and also probably is now authorized to have one of the promised thrones in the kingdom of God that one finds in the tradition. In fact, in Matthew. So Papias says that one of his Greek translations of a Hebrew manuscript, Hebrew Matthew, that never existed, the author or the translator took liberties to create Judas's suicide. And so the issue, what Papias wrote is that Judas survived his attempt to suicide. He perished in his own plot with money that he had used for purchasing it. And God struck him down such that his guts poured out, and he got bloated and maggot infested and so on. Luke is doing the same thing at the beginning of the Acts of the Apostles. There is no suicide in the account that we find in Luke. Rather, he talks about Judas being struck from behind by God such that his guts spilled out on his own plot. And one can put the Matthean version of the Jesus suicide and Papias's version of his surviving the suicide and then being killed by Jesus in the Acts of the Apostles. I don't know another way to explain what's going on. So Luke has got to have known the only other alternative we have for the death of Judas, which appears in Papias. So those are the primary issues. So let me summarize. The prefaces to the two works are similar. Their projects are similar of putting order into the multiple sources that they have. They both agree that Judas did not commit suicide, but was struck in his own field and his guts poured out. We also have the references to Justice Barsabbas and the daughters of Philip and the deaths of James and John and other possible echoes. So I think the evidence for gluing those together is pretty strong.
So now I'd like to pivot to Luke's use of the Homeric epics. How does Luke use Homeric epics perhaps differently than Mark? What kind of mimetic parallels does he take from Mark? And then what does he add that's not in Mark?
Oh, that's a very good question, and I think you put it in the right way. Luke did paraphrase or rewrite Mark. Mark is full of Homeric imitation. And with very few exceptions, Luke has his own paraphrase or his paraphrasing of Mark's mimesis, his imitations. He does add some, though. So, at the beginning of his gospel, he imitates the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite, which is about the conception of Aeneas. And that explains the annunciations to Zechariah and Mary and the announcing to the angels. At the very end of the book, he has, of his gospel, he has the story about Jesus revealing his wounds to his disciples, and they recognize him, and then they make nice. That's how the Odyssey ends, with Odysseus revealing his wound to his father, and then they make nice and then settle in at their estate. There are other places too where we find no, that's not an imitation of Mark, though. I'm sorry, I should have said that's an addition to Mark. But Luke has, for example, his own version of Mark's Gerasene demoniac story, or the Euripidean story of the frothing demoniac, or Jesus calming the wind, or Jesus it goes on and on. So those are the ones that Luke picks up from Matthew. I'm sorry, from Mark. So those are the ones Luke picks up from Mark. I guess I have my own synoptic problem, right, Jacob? I gotta keep things straight. I am 79 years old, so I do have some excuses. There are no parallels to Mark in the Acts of the Apostles. And what characterizes the ones in the Acts of the Apostles is now the imitations are more of the Iliad than they are of the Odyssey. And that's really quite striking. Now, Mark already has created his founding myth to challenge the Homeric imitations in Virgil's Aeneid. Luke sees that project, he endorses it, and he pulls out all the stops in the Acts of the Apostles so that Paul in particular is playing a role that's similar to what one would find in the Iliad. Peter has more of those. So the Council at Jerusalem would be an example. The revelation to Cornelius would be an example. The mission, anyway, it goes on and on. So that's the big difference in Acts. In Acts, it's mostly the Iliad. It has to do, of course, with Jesus' successors and Paul. But it continues the project of trying to imitate the Homeric episodes that also attracted the attention of Virgil.
Does Luke make use of the Iliad or the Odyssey more in his extra editions of the imitations?
He stays with the model in every case. So, for example, if he finds a model in Mark and he imitates it, he embellishes occasionally the imitation, but he doesn't change it over to another epic or another episode. In the Acts of the Apostles, of course, Luke is not imitating Mark, so he doesn't have to worry about that. Very seldom, by the way, Jacob, does the author imitate two episodes at once. I don't even know of an example that I would pull out. He stays with the model. And one reason he stays with the model is that he wants his readers to recognize the imitation. Why? Because he's trying to make a syncresis, that is a comparison that's positive about his characters as opposed to the characters in Homer. So, for example, Hector dies an ignoble death, and the fall of Troy is imminent. Jesus has a terrible death. It anticipates the fall of Jerusalem, but Jesus comes back to life. So that's a syncresis. It's an improvement of one hero over another. Odysseus blinds Polyphemus, steals his sheep, and glorifies in it. In Mark and followed in by Luke, Jesus heals a demoniac, puts him in his right mind, clothes him, and leaves him. So Jesus in Mark and Luke is more compassionate, not only of Odysseus, but also of Virgil's Ulysses, the equivalent. So the author stays pretty much in the context of a single episode in order to demonstrate to the reader that there's a similarity. By the way, it's one of the greatest tragedies of gospel scholarship that mimesis has not been credited. We know that there's imitation of passages in the Jewish Bible, but scholars are very reluctant to see it for Greek poetry, and I understand why. But it really has hamstrung so much good research.
What do you think the literary agenda of the author of Luke Acts was?
Oh, I think it's the creation of a founding myth. It's Luke is not writing a history. He's writing a founding myth, and to challenge Virgil's Aeneid, which is the greatest founding myth of the Roman Empire, the early Roman Empire, and it was recognized to be so. So that's his primary task, is to create a narrative of Christian origins that includes the apostles and so on, not just Jesus, as a way of challenging the founding myth of the Roman Empire. And by the way, St. Augustine recognized what Luke was doing in the city of God, and pits over against each other the kingdom of God, or the city of God, if you will, and the Roman Empire, which is collapsing even as he writes.
We have a super chat question, although it's not on topic. Ifish Natai, thank you for your super chat. Thoughts on the Joanna, granddaughter of High Priest Theophilus ossuary, and only Luke mentions Joanna and Theophilus. Perhaps these Joannas are the same person. Do you want to answer that question?
Well, I can't, because the question is smarter than I am. I doubt if the high priest Theophilus is the same person that Luke is addressing, because the person Luke is addressing is apparently a Greco-Roman official. I think one has to be very careful about inscriptions on ossuaries. There have been false starts a lot. The business about Joanna, I wish I knew. So fish in a tie, I think you're way ahead of me.
And just to be clear, the reason I said it wasn't quite on topic is because we're focusing on Luke's use of Homer and Papias, not trying to identify who exactly is behind each character in history in Luke necessarily. Go ahead, Dennis.
Well, I would just say, in my opinion, any honest question is a good question. So even if it's
I
off
agree.
topic for us, we need to welcome their questions.
I agree. I'm just noting that that
That's
way
fair.
they
That's fair.
understand if a question doesn't get answered.
Yeah.
But I would like to ask you about Luke's use of Q or the logoi and the is it involved in the way that Luke uses Homer at all? Does Luke alter the way he uses Homer in contrast to Mark when he reverses to the earlier version of the Q saying while using Matthew? So
That's another very good question, and it's an important one. In Greek rhetoric, there are two procedures that students are taught about how to treat an antecedent text. The one that is most obvious is paraphrasis, where we get our word paraphrase. And a paraphrasis is a rewriting of a text that already exists on the same topic. And the Greek word that they use for that as a source is a prototypus, a prototype. But even more important than paraphrasis in ancient rhetoric was mimmesis. Mimmesis is the imitation of a text that exists, but it's on a different topic. So you in the one case, paraphrasis is the use of a source, mimesis is the use of a typos, a model about something else. So one needs to see in Luke, or one can see in Luke, both mimesis, that is the imitation of a model, in this case, mostly Homer, but not entirely, also Plato, also Euripides, and so on. That's mimesis. When it comes to Luke and Mark, the intertextual project is paraphrasis, because Luke and Mark are prototypi, that is, they're prototypes, they're sources. So Mark is interested in paraphrasing Q and Mark, but sometimes when he paraphrases it, he adds his own mimesis. I'll give you a wonderful example. Mark certainly saw in Mark the story of Jesus going before his neighbors in Nazareth, and they shun him. And he's surprised that they have so little faith. And he goes and tries to find others who can advance his career and so on. That's the disciples. And you have that in Luke as well. But when Luke tells the story of the rejection of Nazareth, he uses the story in the Odyssey of Telemachus being shunned by his neighbors in Ithaca. And he has a long similarity with that story. So there you have a combination of paraphrasis of Mark, or even the Q document, in my view, and the embellishment of the paraphrasis with mimesis, Homeric mimesis. That's a splendid example, it seems to me. One other thing to say about mimesis that is not well understood, even by scholars. In order for hermeneutically significant mimesis to take place, there are three projects. You have to choose a model that you're going to try to emulate. Then in emulating it, you need to advance enough similarities so the reader sees the parallels. You think parallel lives. But then comes the conclusion, the synchresis. This is where the author makes it clear that the hero, that in this case, Jesus or Paul, let's say, is superior to the characters that you'd find in Greek mythology. So you find over and over and over again in Mark and Luke this project of choosing a model that is well known, then creating similarities so people see the parallels, and then the synchresis to show that your hero is better than another hero. And that's the project of the founding myth, to say that our myth is more satisfactory than your myth. That is the mythologies of the Greeks and in Rome with the Aeneid. So it really is a fascinating thing to study, and it's unfortunately not been recognized in the history of gospel scholarship until the late 20th century, and still is rejected by the majority of New Testament scholars.
I'd now like to ask you about Luke's use of 2 Kings 4:29, where Elijah tells Gehazi, "Gird your loins, take my stick in your hand, and go. If you should find a man, do not greet him. And if a man should greet you, do not respond to him. And you will lay my stick on the face of the child."
I'm not sure that I have much to say about that.
It's you bring it up in your book, Two Shipwrecked Gospels, and it's just after you talk about Luke redacting 2 accounts serially, Mark 6:7-10, in 9:1-4, and the Lost Gospel in 10:4-9. That's when you bring up the comparison of Gehazi and Elijah.
But it certainly sounds familiar. What do you think?
Well, from what I'm seeing here, I think you have a point, but I'm gonna shift to a different question. So,
Give me 30 seconds.
okay.
Oh, this is I think you have in mind the healing of the widow's son in Nain. I'm pretty sure you do. And that's a very good example of mimesis of a Jewish text. That's what it is. And the parallels are really quite remarkable. And the synchresis is that Jesus is as powerful and perhaps more so than Elijah or Elisha. Forget it must be Elisha. In the healing of this widow's son. And in fact, the language is the same exactly in the statement, and Jesus gave him to his mother. And in both cases, you have a widow, you have a dead son, you have the raising of the son, the statement of, "I'm going to hand you to your mother," and so on. So the reason I had trouble putting this together is it's not mimesis of Homer at all. It's mimesis of a famous story in the prophet cycle.
So now I'd like to go back to Papias for a moment. And you mentioned that when it talks about Luke 10, when you mentioned Luke 10, 23-25, it refers to the 70 returned with joy. And you connect that with Papias, when Papias says that to some of them, apparently angels who once had been divine, he gave them authority to rule over the arrangement of the earth and gave them orders to rule well. And you connect that to Luke's account of Jesus sending out the 70.
I'm kind of stumbling on it. Luke has two sending stories. One of them comes from Q, and the other one comes from Mark. And the one from Q is the second one. And in the Q document, Jesus, the devil at the temptation, says, cast yourself down from the pinnacle of the temple and the angels will rescue you. And Jesus, and that's a quotation of Psalm 90. Jesus refuses to do so. But in the sending of the 70, which happens later, the very next verse, Jacob, the very next verse that you have in the Psalter says that don't be surprised. I saw Satan falling, and the asp will not, you will not be harmed by the asp or the ballast or the serpent, and so on. So what Jesus refuses as divine assistance in the Q document early on then becomes the promise that he can make to his disciples that they shouldn't be fearful when they go on their mission. I think maybe that's what you're fishing for.
And this is the next question that's directly connected to that. Would you say that this is extra evidence of Luke's use of Papias, especially because Papias lacks the specific detail that Jesus sent the 70, and Luke puts more emphasis by adding the specific number 70 when they're sending them out?
Well, I don't think Papias refers to the sending of disciples at all.
No, I know that, but the reason I put it that way is because Papias refers to angels who had been given authority over the rule over the arrangement of the earth. And Luke is inspired by that to instead have that happen with the disciples.
That is a very interesting connection, and it's one that I hadn't thought of. I can tell you that Enrico Norelli convinced me that this business about the fall of the angels is related to the book of Revelation. And I don't think, and by the way, Norelli thinks that Papias knew the prophecies in the book of Revelation, maybe not in its final edition, but some edition. So Norelli understands that in terms of the book of Revelation. But I think what you're talking about merits attention. There could be something there. Good work for you.
Oh, thank you. Now, I know that Papias' writings don't survive very well. We have very little of what he wrote. But is it, from what you've seen, is it possible that, of course it's possible, but is there any detectable evidence of Luke being influenced in the way he uses Homer from the writings of Papias?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. No. By the way, I would go a little further than that. I think Papias and the Elder John, even though they had these documents that have Homeric imitations in them, I don't think they saw the Homeric imitations at all. In fact, Papias says in his preface that he's getting his information from these books, but even more so from oral traditions. That is, people who have had encounters with Jesus or Christian origins, and they come by and tell him what they know. And Papias says he wrote it down. And he trusted those living voices more than texts. So Papias would have been appalled, I think appalled at the notion that these Gospels have Homeric imitation. I think he was probably from a Jewish environment. Certainly the people he's talking to were. And I just don't think that Papias or the Elder John were sophisticated in that way. By the way, if the Elder John is the same John that wrote the epistles, the same thing happens. The author knows Jewish texts very well, but doesn't know Greek poetry or philosophy at all, as far as we can tell. So I think in that case, Luke and Papias are in different worlds.
I want to go back to what we discussed before about Q's use of Homer. And my second part to that question is Q's, the way, is Luke influenced at all indirectly from Homer via Q?
Yes, I think he is. But I think there are only a few places where one could make a case for it. The most obvious one is at the beginning of the Q document. And if you look at the traditional reconstructions of Q, the only thing you find is some stuff about John the Baptist, Jesus's baptism, and his temptations by the devil. But what you find in the Q document is much more developed. And by the way, of course, the issue always is with Q. The nature of the argument for the reconstruction, because we don't have any fragments of the Q document. So anything one says about Q has to be reconstructed from the criteria one uses. And the criteria that usually is used does not include Mark in the assessment. My view in the Q plus Papias hypothesis is that Mark is the earliest and may be the most important witness to Q. At least one of the most important witnesses. Now, if that is the case, one can reconstruct what's going on at the beginning of the Logoi of Jesus more clearly. Now, I'm going to begin now with the first two books of the Odyssey, Jacob, and I'm going to tell you what the general storyline is, and it won't take forever. And then I'll go to the story that appears apparently in the Logoi of Jesus, and you'll recognize everything there, because in one way or another, it is in the Gospels. At the beginning of the Odyssey, Telemachus and Penelope are at a home that is infested by over 100 young suitors who think that Odysseus will never return. And one of them wants to marry Penelope less for her company than for her wealth, because Odysseus was a local king. Athena takes a look at what's going on in Ithaca, and she says, "This is outrageous, my father Zeus. I'm going to fly down there, and I'm going to help Telemachus." And Zeus consents. So Athena takes on the form of Mentes and flies down to Telemachus, and she begins by saying, "Look at these bums. What they're doing is outrageous. And I hope that Odysseus comes back and with his 2 spears and kills them all." Then she says, "By the way, young man, you really are the son of your father. And you now need to fill his boots and get rid of these suitors yourself, whether he returns or not. Then, with that information she given, Athena flies away like a bird. Telemachus, now empowered by the goddess, says to the suitors, "You bums, you have to get out of here. I've had it." And they resist. They said, no, we can give you some authority over your house and so on. We can negotiate this, although that's a lie. We can negotiate this, but no, we're not leaving. So then Telemachus pulls together a council of his friends, his neighbors, and he says, this is what's going on. I can't oust these guys by themselves. They're not going to leave on their own. And I need your help to oust them, because his neighbors outnumber the suitors, and these neighbors are the parents of some of these young men. And they refuse to do so. So then what does Telemachus do? He takes up Athena's plan B, and he goes to the shore, and he, with Athena, acquires a ship and a crew to sail over to Pylos, so he can now find out about his father and restore his kingdom. Now, what goes on at the beginning of not just the Gospel of Q, or the Q Gospel, but also in the Synoptics? John the Baptist plays the role of Athena, and she says, "You brood of snakes. Look at all this nonsense that you're doing. I hope what makes you think you can avoid wrath? The one to come is stronger than I am. He's already got his pitchfork in his hands, and he's going to take the wicked and burn them in a fire that won't be quenched." Just like Athena. What happens next? The Holy Spirit comes on Jesus flies like a dove, descends on him. And he then is told that he is the new Son of God from the heavenly voice. So that's the empowerment of Jesus, like Telemachus. So then what happens? Then there's a temptation between Jesus and the devil, and it includes as the last temptation, authority over all the kingdoms of the world. Now, that's a lie for sure by the devil. He doesn't have the authority to do that, although Luke thinks he does. But Jesus refuses to worship the devil, even if it means that he had authority over all the world. So then what does Jesus do? He goes and he announces the advent of the kingdom of God. Now, the next thing that happens is that Jesus goes to Nazareth among his friends, and they snub him. That's what happened to Telemachus. His friends snubbed him. So then what does Jesus do? He goes to near Capernaum, which is on the sea, and he acquires 3 volunteers who can help him in declaring the kingdom of God. When Mark gets a hold of that, he makes those people fishermen. So Luke and Mark know what the Q document is doing, and those parallels in the empowerment of young men cannot be denied. And as far as I know, nobody has seen it but Jacob. And I think that's one of the greatest finds that one can make of mimesis in the New Testament. Mimesis is present already in the Q document. It goes from the beginning of the Q document to the end of the Acts of the Apostles. The only major exceptions are Matthew and Papias, who are still attached to the Jewish understanding of the context for Jesus and his mission. But that's not true for the other Gospels. And by the way, New Testament scholars are happier, I think, generally, with the position of Papias, of Matthew and maybe Papias, than they are with the Hellenism of Mark and Q and Luke. But let me back off and say, the author of the Q document imitates the Odyssey to narrate the empowerment of Jesus. But he does so in the context of Judaism. He's not trying to say that Jesus is better than Telemachus. He just wants to have a literary model that allows him to say how Jesus became empowered by God early on. But inside of that discussion are all kinds of allusions to Deuteronomy in particular, but also to the prophets. So, for example, in the Temptations, Jesus quotes Deuteronomy 3 times. The devil quotes the Psalter. The calling of the disciples is similar to the Elijah calling Elisha. And so the Q document and Matthew have a lot in common that way, that they are both oriented toward placing the Jesus career in the context of the fortunes of Israel.
So now I'd like to ask you about Luke's prodigal son and its basis on Matthew's parable of the two sons. Does this story have a Homeric origin?
Oh, yes, it certainly does. But it's not just one episode. So let's start with a general survey of who Odysseus was. Odysseus left his home to fight in the Trojan War. He was gone for 20 years, 10 for the fight and 10 for the return. On his return, he slept for long periods of time with Circe and Calypso. His men were forced by Circe, after she turned them into swine, to eat the food of swine. Odysseus finally is able to return home, and he finds that his father and his family generally, but his father has been longing for him to come and has hoped that he was still alive. And then when they encounter each other, there's an embrace and a feast, but then it calls into question what happened to the older brother. I'm sorry, I'm getting these confused. So let's stay with the Odyssey. So Odysseus finally comes home. He reveals himself to his father. They embrace. Then they have a feast. But the people in Ithaca are not happy with what happened, namely that Odysseus and Telemachus killed their children, their suitor boys. So what happens in parable of the two sons, the prodigal son. The prodigal leaves with wealth from his family. He's gone for a long time. He squanders his money on prostitutes. He's forced to eat the feed of swine, carob seed, and so on. He says, I've got to go back to my father, and I'll just say, I want to be one of your slaves. I've really blown it. So he comes back, and his father is waiting for him, hoping that he hadn't died while he was gone for so long. And they embrace. And then what happens after the embracing? There's a celebration, a feast, and the awarding of a ring and a robe. But the older brother is not happy about it at all. And he says, look, I've been faithful all this time, what about me? And the father says, look, I thought this boy was dead, and now he's alive. And you need to rejoice with me. You'll get your own reward. The parallels, Jacob, are really quite striking. And I'm sorry that I got my narrative confused, because they do blend to each other so much. So the prodigal son is Luke's version of Jesus telling us, is Jesus is telling a story that is similar to the Odyssey. And the point is that one should welcome the sinner the same way that the father welcomes the sinful young man.
And what about the parable of the lost coin? Is there any Homeric connections there?
Not that I know of, no.
So Luke just gets that straight from Q?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I'm not the only one who thinks so, by the way. Many people talk about the parable of the coin and the lost sheep as coming from Q.
Whatever unique parables that Luke possesses, let me rephrase that question. What other parallels does Luke get from Matthew, which Matthew gets from Homer, besides the prodigal son?
Matthew gets almost nothing from Homer. And the only thing that I see in Matthew that might be an imitation of Homer, Luke rejects. So Luke's relationship to Matthew is not secondhand mimesis. It would be straightforward parophysis. And in most cases, Luke is more primitive in the Q parallels than Matthew, but often Matthew's more primitive than than Luke. I have a synoptic problem, apparently.
Did Matthew have Homer's Odyssey in mind when he came up with the parable of the two sons, or did Luke simply embellish that narrative with Homeric details when he created the prodigal son?
In my view, I think Matthew got the parable of the two sons already from Q. I know other people don't say that, but I think Luke is an expansion of Matthew, and Matthew was a parophysis of what he found in the Q document. And the big issue, I think, in the Q document is this. The author is critical of Jews who are not being faithful. And he says that it's like the son who says, Dad, I'll be glad to go out to work. I'll be glad to obey Torah. Then he doesn't. There are other people say, I'm not going to do Torah. But then they do. They're righteous. So I think this is very consistent with the position of the Logoi of Jesus about wayward Jews who say they're going to do justice and they don't. and others who may not earlier, and this could be Gentiles potentially, they were not fond of Jewish Torah, and yet they led righteous lives.
And in my final question, how does Luke present Jesus overall? How has he changed the way Jesus looks, or not looks, but the way he is portrayed in the narrative, versus in contrast with the previous two Gospels, Matthew and Mark?
That is another brilliant question, and it's a good one to end our podcast with. Luke creates a Jesus who is much more like Socrates than he is like Hector, for example. This is especially true in his passion narrative, where Jesus forgives the person who's those who are killing him. He goes to his death willingly. He is not at Gethsemane. He's not tormented the way that Mark's Jesus is. He's going willfully. His last words at the cross are not, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" but a triumphant statement, "Into your hands I give my spirit." Luke is interested in making Jesus a equivalent to a Greek philosopher, not a loser like the Homeric hero Hector, who dies a miserable death and thinks God has abandoned him. Although, of course, God doesn't. God raises him from the dead. But you see the same pattern clearly in the Acts of the Apostles. Paul begins his ministry basically by going to Athens and disputing philosophers, and who could, even in antiquity, people saw that as Socratic. And then you have philosophical arguments that follow. You have Paul's apologiae, that is his speeches defending himself the same way that Socrates does in the Apology. Again, his courageous attitude toward death, his understanding of the afterlife. So Luke's founding myth is saturated with making Jesus, Peter, and especially Paul, into Socratic philosophers. And by the way, this is something that does not happen in Virgil's Aeneid. Virgil's Aeneas is not a philosopher. He's a warrior. He's a faithful father and leader of his people. He is pious Aeneas, but he is not philosophical Aeneas. And this is a part of the founding myth for Luke, to portray the Christian heroes as Socratic.
And before we close, I'd like to remind everybody real quick that the links to purchase Dennis's books will be in the description below and the pinned comment. And the link to his website will also be contained down there as well. And with that being said, Dennis, thank you very much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure, Jacob.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.